Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, we will have another episode of our continuing Windows security series. Today, we're going to be talking about Windows Firewall. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about this particular topic is I read a blog from one of our MVPs, and I'll link that in the show notes, and it's really good. But Windows Firewall is one of those things that is often either misconfigured or forgotten about, and it is a key part of your endpoint and server security. When I read through the blog, I thought to myself, this is not something that I've checked often or even maybe ever, where I just usually depend on the default firewall that's built in. Maybe you have a third party. Maybe you have some archaic GPOs that are opening ports on your endpoints that you may have not looked at or forgotten about. If you joined an organization and they have a very, I would say, maybe mature or just legacy Active Directory instance. So it does behoove you to take a day or so and take a look at it, audit it, and make sure. Now, Windows Firewall has been enabled by default for a very long time, unless you're using some third-party software that may turn it off and use the third party. But it does help by adding some specific deny rules, I would say. Of course, like you can allow some ports to be open too for specific applications if you needed to, but that's where this audit comes in, because maybe you have some application that you used to use long ago that needed some open port on your endpoints and now you don't. And so definitely look through those GPOs, do an audit of it. But yeah, I mean, like you can add specific deny rules. Like, for example, RDP is enabled by default on Windows Firewall, so you can deny RDP. Or TCP port 444, which is used for reverse PowerShell. You can have a specific deny rule, because when do you actually need a reverse PowerShell? Probably never on an endpoint, maybe on a server if you're doing some sort of PowerShell scripting that you need to do, but you probably don't need to it on most servers as well. So take a look at those. The blog does have a text file, a JSON that you can import to configure a lot of very common firewall rules. So if you have GPOs, you can import these and at least use that as a security baseline.
We've been doing this Windows security series on and off now, really since the birth of the show. And I think for a lot of these technologies, like Credential Guard as an example, or Application Guard, they've been technologies that I'd say a lot of folks aren't familiar with. In this case, it's kind of the latter. In my experience, most orgs do just use Windows Firewall, Defender Firewall built in for their firewall needs on the endpoint. But I think now is a good time, again, new year, fresh start, kind of looking at things for the very first time, to go back and re-look at this and give it a fresh viewing. In particular, I have found that so much related to the endpoint is legacy and was implemented a long time ago, and nobody even knows why it's implemented that way anymore. And it's always a great time to go back and just look at it again and ask the question of, like, if nobody can speak to why we have this firewall rule in place, then throw it out. If you don't know why, don't be afraid of that change, because that's how technical debt builds up. When you don't have anyone to speak to why something in place and you just keep doing it because, well, that's the way we've always done it. Like, we all know that's the worst answer in the world. And yet a lot of IT is that way. Well, that's the way we've always done it. So that's why we have that rule in place, even though nobody can tell me why. I think it's okay sometimes in the fight for better security. And you have to have leadership that's supportive of this, but to tear stuff like that out and wait to hear screaming. It's a really effective way of figuring if you need something or not. And if you can have a good rollback plan and you can roll it back really quickly, then no harm, no foul. You'll fix it quick. But that also ensures that you have a good feedback mechanism from your end users who are, the ones who actually make your company money, to your service desk, to engineering, and that message can flow quickly and efficiently. But this is a great opportunity to do that.
I love that call out because it is definitely one way to get things done quickly. If you remember what happened at Twitter, Elon Musk said they needed to reduce the amount of microservices that they were paying for, and they turned off 80% of them. And one of the microservices happened to be the service that sends out the SMS text if you had SMS MFA enabled. So it didn't disable MFA, that people just didn't get the text from the microservice that was supposed to send the text. And so, they had to roll that back. Now, I'm not saying that you do that at your company, turn off 80% of your microservices, but it's very effective if you don't know what something is and just kind of give a heads up, have a good change management process, document a rollback plan, say, I'm going to turn this off because nobody knows what it does. It looks archaic. It's unsafe. It is insecure. We're going to take this out and see what happens. And if nothing happens, then you're good to go. And then at least have that documented. Or if somebody yells about it, then you can say, oh, this port is for this business critical application, and have that documented going forward.
Right. Absolutely. And Andy, I know you of all people would not be defending some of the ways things have operated at Twitter since Mr. Musk took over. However, I think there are some lessons to learn from there. Maybe they can be implemented in a more humane way, or maybe with a little more thought and consideration put into them. But there are a lot of people, and I sound like a former president when I said this, a lot of people are saying, but to be serious, there were a lot of people on Twitter who were proclaiming that the service was going to fall over dead in weeks or days, with some of the massive headcount cuts they experienced. And to be fair, and probably through the heroic efforts of those who are still on staff, the service has not fallen apart. Now, the moderation could use some work, don't get me wrong, but it is a good real world example of something can be very bloated, both from a architectural perspective as well as maybe from a personnel perspective. And when you're forced to make really tough decisions, that's when you get to the crux of the issue. That's when you really determine what's important. And so, not saying like turn off all your firewall rules and wait to hear screaming, but again, if like nobody can justify, why do we have this port open? Why are we doing that? Then it's probably best to close it and then figure out, why does it need to be open if it does? And if you determine, oh, well, this one business unit with 5 people in it uses this legacy application, guess what? You can deploy a firewall rule to those 5 people and document it, and you're good to go. And now you have just secured the organization. And as long as you have leadership support, you have a smooth communications channel so that when they start yelling, you hear the yelling. That's probably okay in my mind. Now, that's easy for me to say, no longer working in IT, but I did for years and years. And sometimes I think we were too risk averse, too change averse, to make meaningful improvements and meaningful changes. And so sometimes just by the nature of not having stuff documented, having people depart with a lot of institutional knowledge in their brain, there's no way to solve this. And carrying it forward forever is not a great choice.
Now, if you have your firewall rules already and you want to just migrate them from GPO to modern management, because as we've talked about on our show, modern management, co-management using Azure AD Join or Intune to manage your Windows devices is the future. there is a Defender Firewall rule migration tool. So we'll put that link in the show notes for you. You can run the tool on a reference machine, and that will pull the current Windows Firewall configuration. And when you run it, it automatically will have you log into Intune or Azure, I should say, and you should have an admin who's able to create those rules, because the tool will actually create the new Intune policies for you from the collected reference machine. So it's very smooth. If you have something and you've already gone through this exercise and you're like, we have our firewall rules, I did this audit last year, it's good to go, you can run this tool and just migrate all those there. Now, you can also do it through PowerShell. If you're a command shell junkie, you can migrate your existing rules using NetSH, or manually deploy them if you want. If you only have a few and you're like, I don't have time to run anything, you can just add a new firewall rule in the Windows Defender configuration policy in Intune or the Security Center within the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Firewall modification is another thing. So it's great that if you do have rules, it's great if you have it enabled. But if, as a user, I'm able to turn that off, then that completely negates the whole reason of why we have a firewall. So you want to make sure that you have a device configuration policy to prevent users from being able to turn off the firewall, as well as adding different rules or allow rules. If they somehow download an application and they're like, oh, this needs a firewall modification to work, then adding those in. Now, with most modern applications, this is probably less of a concern, because most applications, if they're using network protocol, are using 443. So, and that usually is already open, and that's not something that you can close off. But if it's some weird application that is a one-off, maybe that you might have to. Once you deploy the configuration policy, you can go into the Windows setting and make sure that little toggle is grayed out so that you can't do it. You should also check the MMC, the old school settings, go in there, because sometimes even if the modern settings are grayed out, the old school settings, if you launch the MMC as an admin, you're still able to turn off the firewall from there. So just doing a double check after your policy is deployed. You do also want to make sure that your firewall is turned on for public, private, and domain network. I know a lot of orgs used to have it turned off for domain networks, but you want to have it turned on for everything, because zero trust, right? Even if someone's on your network, you want to make sure that your endpoints are secured. And then finally, auditing. If you're using Intune, Intune has a built-in report to look at any co-managed or Intune managed machine about the firewall status. Of course, you can always pull a report using PowerShell. Just dump it into a CSV and look at that if that's how you want to do it. But auditing it and making sure that your policies are sticking. Any final thoughts, Adam?
I think you hit most of the highlights there. I personally will say one thing I learned today: did not know there was a firewall migration tool to Intune. I knew there was a GPO migration tool. I didn't know there was a firewall one. That's awesome. And I got on my soapbox last show and encouraged people to continue to look at co-management and conditional access for their devices, but also said, you still move forward on that modern management piece as well, maybe in a parallel track. This is a way where you can continue to move things into Intune so that you don't even need Configuration Manager on some devices. Maybe you have a lighter use case where Intune management is all you need. Well, if you want to make sure your firewall rules are there, here you go. And again, I talked about those inflection points that make you sit up and say, hey, let's take another look at this. Let's make sure this still reflects our current needs. This is a great time to do that as well. We said the same thing about GPOs with the GPO migration tool. You're going to have GPOs on there And I think it was Shannon Fritz, when he was on our show, talked about, it'll come back and be like, yeah, I couldn't move these 20 GPOs. And you'll go look and they'll be like IE5, IE6 GPOs that are no longer needed or supported. And that's not a big deal. So again, great opportunity to look at it. And I loved your call out as well. Firewall should be turned on in all scenarios. Do not turn it on just because you're on the corporate network. It's not trusted. It should not be trusted. It is no more inherently secure than any other network. So, don't do that. Trust no one. Trust no network.
Very good. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.